iniziando la seconda giornata del secondo appuntamento del Public Program legato al padiglione Italia e all'opera di Massimo Bartolini. Programma che si svolge in 4 puntate, quindi ancora a metà luglio e poi a metà settembre. Ogni episodio ha un tema legato più o meno direttamente al lavoro di Massimo e ai temi svolti, diciamo, dal padiglione, dalle ricerche legate intorno al padiglione. Oggi abbiamo, quindi per chi appunto non sa dove si trova, ripeto, il tema di queste 2 giornate è fiducia nello sfondo, ascoltare con la natura, e quindi è un tema che da tanto tempo importante nel lavoro di Massimo, anche nel padiglione, anche se forse in modi che sono più legati alle performance che ci sono state anche ieri e che ci sono state all'inaugurazione, e al lavoro che avete ascoltato prima, cioè quello pensato da Massimo con la musica di Gavin e di Yuri Bryars, che è legato a una poesia in cui un individuo si pensa, si senta essere albero, essere pieno di radice e quindi connesso al tutto. E questo mi dà lo spunto per introdurre, io lo faccio in italiano, poi Gaia lo fa in inglese, giusto? How many English speakers are here? Good, so it deserved the English. E questo mi dà l'opportunità per reintrodurre, perché è stato con noi anche ieri, David Haskell, uno scrittore americano, 2 volte finalista del premio Pulitzer, che abbiamo avuto appunto il piacere di avere già ieri a parlare di un altro suo libro, che è Il canto degli alberi. Oggi in conversazione con Francesco Bergamo, che è un ricercatore, un docente qui allo Iuav di Venezia, nel dipartimento onomatopeico appunto dello Iuav, quindi si occupa di ascolto e suoni e musica e ricerca musicale. Saranno in conversazione a parlare invece di quello che è l'ultimo libro, stiamo facendo una pubblicità smaccata, di David, che è Suoni, fragili, selvaggi, Sounds Wild and Broken, un libro che stiamo un po' tutti leggendo in questi giorni, in questi mesi, con grande piacere, pieno veramente di rivelazioni, di conoscenze, di una storia di come è nato il suono nel mondo in qualche modo e come noi lo viviamo attraverso 1000 riverberi, da uno strumento musicale a una sala da concerto. E lascio a Gaia, intanto ringrazio Gaia per il supporto, l'aiuto fondamentale nel programma che stiamo facendo e che faremo fino a settembre, che poi sfocerà, lo diciamo, in una pubblicazione, che è la pubblicazione finale di questo progetto, 2 Qui to Hear. E ringrazio ovviamente i presenti e gli ospiti, ancora David e Francesco, e lascio a Gaia per una introduzione anglosassone. Grazie, a più tardi.
So thank you, grazie Luca, and thank you everybody for being here today. And thanks to students who are an important part of this public program. And thanks to Massimo Bartolini, who let us be all together here, traversing the beautiful project of Due Qui to Here. We intended this public program as a building up of a temporary community of people around and together with the listening. So I invite all of you to pose questions, to share your thoughts, and to intervene in the language that you prefer. And I apologize in advance with who is not confident with both Italian and English, because we decided to switch from Italian to English and vice versa in order to maintain this spontaneous situation and very informal and enjoying this context, first of all. And let me introduce the guests that will be in conversation today. We had David George Haskell yesterday with a talk about the songs of the trees. And today I'm very pleased to introduce you Francesco Bergamo, who is a friend and a researcher. And this conversation is also the result of this community of people that, starting from Venice, is now together with Italian Pavilion and all the team and this incredible project. And thanks to the Sound Studies Hub, which is a transdisciplinary center that is within the Iuav University of Venice and is the first research center dedicated to sound studies in the Italian academia. So thanks to David and thanks to Francesco, and I will just spend a few words about their bios so that you can also have some more details. So David George Haskell, he's a writer and a biologist. His books about forest, people, sensory richness of life have received several honors and awards, including the National Academy's Best Book Award, Iris Book Award, Reed Environmental Writing Award, and National Outdoor Book Award for Natural History Literature, among others. David is professor at the University of the South in St. Louis, Tennessee, a fellow of the Linnean Society of London, and a Guggenheim Fellow. Francesco Bergamo, he's an architect, and he has a PhD in science of design with a thesis of aesthetics and ecology of interaction design. He is assistant professor at the Università Iuav di Venezia. His research focuses mostly on the genealogies and forms of contemporary representational artifacts for architecture, design, politics, art, and sonic ecology, and on the mutual relation between aural and visual cultures. His most recent book is Il disegno del paesaggio sonoro, published by Mimesis. And he recently edited an issue of AD Architectural Design titled In Praise of Penumbra with Agostino De Rosa and Alessio Portot. He coordinates the Sound Studies Hub research group and the LADS, Laboratorio Strumentale per la Didattica at the Iuav University. So I leave the floor to them, and thank you, everybody.
Okay, so good afternoon, and well, first of all, I would like to thank Luca Cerizza, Gaia Martino, Massimo Bartolini, Francesca Verga for this invitation, for the opportunity to collaborate with the Sound Studies Hub, with the Iuav University, and also for the opportunity to have here David Haskell. There are many readers of his books among us. I'm starting with a brief introduction. I'm not going to go into the topics of the book, but I would like to try to explain why David's work and maybe most of all his most recent book, which is Sounds Wild and Broken, is so much important to many of us, and also some connections that I happen to to find with the work of Massimo for the pavilion, and also with this public program. I'm trying to be very short because the best part is yet to come, so don't fall asleep in these early minutes, please. Also, maybe some of the students here are already familiar with the work of David. I started to recommend it to students last year. I know that Nicola Di Croce, who is here, and he's maybe the main founding member of the Sound Studies Hub, has been doing the same for this course. The one first connection which came to my mind is about one occasion when David's book was mentioned, and it was during the presentation of Diana Lola Posani, who was here yesterday, and I think she's around here, in Milan, the presentation of her books with the translations of the books of Pauline Oliveros. And David's book was mentioned alongside another book, which has not been translated into English yet, which is Eliane Brum's Amazonia, which is another important political book about this complex ecosystem, this complex forest, where which she becomes part of. But I was also thinking about the presentation of the workshop Super Paesaggio of Attila, Enrico, and Nicola yesterday, during which they mentioned different levels of listening in some way. So the background, which is also in the title of this part of the public program, the production of sound given the background sounds, the environment's response, and the microphones, and so on. Today the program is going to close with their performance. I think that some of these things maybe are going to be presented by them. And so why is David's books, are David's books so precious for us? Well, I think like some of you who have read these books spent really a lot of time reading with great care every single paragraph, because there is richness in every single paragraph which could sparkle a conversation only starting from a few rows. But I found myself very much guided in a sort of path through listening, a path of new discovery of the world I inhabit. This made me think about some things. I thought about Jacob von Oeschul idea of the guide as someone who is capable of showing people who are not familiar with an environment what is actually happening there without they being aware of. So you have to have the knowledge of what's going on in order to go deep, and also have the ability to explain to people who are not experts, and in many cases not familiar what's going on in the environment, in the world. I think this also makes sense and resonates with the bodhisattva that Massimo chose to have at the entrance of the pavilion. And one very surprising thing I found in these readings, which I never found before in any other book, is I think an unusual and necessary epistemological perspective. So a way of thinking about the world which I never found before in any other book. We know that we are dealing with a complex world, that we are discovering new complexities with the new technologies, but also with the new discoveries about intelligent materials, of the behavior of fungi. And in these books, if you're going to read them, you're going to find a continuous shift of perspective from different points of observation, from different disciplines. It is a book which starts by rewriting somehow the evolutionary story of life on the planet Earth. And it arrives to the production of music, which apparently seems strange, but it perfectly makes sense if we consider the production of music as part of the evolution on the planet Earth of a specific species, which is ours, of the human beings. And talking earlier with David, I was saying that one paradigmatic example of this approach of his can be found probably in the first chapter of the book he presented yesterday, The Song of Trees, where he describes a ladder, not really a ladder, he describes a tree, which is the coral tree. Sorry, I've read them mostly in Italian, so I'm not a biologist nor a botanist, so I may be wrong about some of these terms. And through this ladder, it is possible to experience at different height the behavior of rain with this tree, of different animals with this tree. So the local inhabitants usually deal with this tree by standing on the ground, but by climbing this ladder, it is possible to observe different phenomena. And so what David is capable of doing is keeping all of these levels together. The Western scientific perspective, which deals with abstractions in which we believe in, as he writes in this chapter, and also at the same time the embodied perspective of other dwellers of this planet. But I don't want to talk too much. I would like to give to leave the floor to David. So maybe I invite him to start telling us something about his book, and maybe mostly about we can start with the first part of the book. So how sound, the production of sound and listening of sound became so much important in our planet for how we know it today.
Well, thank you, and thank you for the invitation to be with you all today. It really is just a great honor. So sono molto grato for your welcome and your creating this opportunity for conversation and connection. And I hope as we sit here in the conversation, you will all have a diffuse sense of listening as well to the sounds of the wind in the trees and the gulls and the chickadees and so on. So we're in a very rich soundscape here, merging with the art that Massimo has created for us, coming from inside the hall here. So a very generative place, and I'm delighted to play a small part in that. So indeed, the book starts by asking the question, how did the world come to be so full of sound? I mean, think about, we're hearing birds, we're hearing human voice, we're hearing human music and creativity and the sounds of wind and trees. There's extraordinary richness of sound. But the Earth was not always this way. In fact, for 9/10 of Earth's history, there were no living voices as we would know them now, insect songs, or the songs of birds, or it was a planet with life on it, but that life, as far as we know, didn't have any communicative sound making between bacteria. And even for hundreds of millions of years, among the first complex animals that evolved in the oceans and on land, total communicative silence. Now they walked, they made sound as they were walking, as they were chewing their food and flying, but it wasn't until just the last few 100 million years that the insects evolved song, and then the birds and the mammals and the frogs, and soundscapes assembled over time through relationship one to another. So insects were probably the first singers on the planet, maybe starting about 275 million years ago. That's the first fossil evidence we have of an insect. It's an insect fossil from the south of France that rubbed its wings together the way katydids and crickets do today and made a chirping sound. But the mammals at that time, or the ancestors of the mammals, had really terrible hearing. They could only hear really low frequency sounds, and they could only hear those sounds by resting their jaw on the ground or by bone conduction from the ground up into their ear. And yet suddenly the world was filled with protein snacks, insects, that were making sound and advertising their presence. And so the evolution of sound making and singing by insects created a selection, natural selection, for mammals and the ancestors of mammals to increase the frequency of their hearing so they could detect all this food around them. And now when I speak, I'm using that legacy because I'm speaking at a frequency that previously our ancestors couldn't hear at. And so we owe our voices indirectly to insects. And there are other layers of contingency and connection that come back through time. And so the opening part of the book is trying to tease apart these different stories. And it was the part of the book that took the longest to write because I thought, okay, I know some of this story, you know, I'll find the references in the scientific literature and put this thing together. And it turns out there is very, very little written about the paleontology of sound, what the Earth sounded like 300 million years ago, 600 million years ago, even 20 million years ago, which is a blink in geologic time. And so it took a lot of searching to find examples of what were the first singing insects and how did they relate to other species. To put together what is a sketch, and my hope for the book is that in 10, 20 years it will be completely out of date, because in putting this story out there, I'm hoping to stimulate curiosity. And of course, curiosity then leads to new discoveries, and people will find some frog that was evolved much earlier on singing. And so I'm hoping there'll be new discoveries to make my book completely out of date. But for the moment, it's still pretty good in terms of its relation to the scientific record. And so, I mean, you mentioned this sort of scientific approach. For me, science is a great way of listening in a particular way. If we want to understand what did the Earth sound like 300 million years ago, we can use biology and paleontology to ask that. But then the answer we get is not just a scientific answer, it's an aesthetic answer. And an answer about what does it mean to be a human. Because if I owe my voice to the insects, what does that mean in terms of how should I live my life? I think there's it's not an obvious ethical answer, but there's a seeping of that scientific knowledge into our ways of thinking about ourselves. That I think one of the ways that we solve those puzzles is through art, whether it's sonic art or sculpture, visual art, or writing, which I think of as, in a way, as maybe I'm being presumptuous here, but as sound sculpture, because when we write something on the page, we are taking sound from the air, from the spoken word, and laying it in lines of ink on the page, so the sound is resting inside the book. And when we read it aloud, of course, that sound comes back into the air. But even when we read silently, the listening parts of our brain, the oral parts of our brain, activate as if we were listening to words being spoken to us. So reading is a way of listening quite literally to the voices of people who are not with us. When you read a poem from someone, a poet from someone who died hundreds of years ago, their voice quite literally rises from the grave and activates in our consciousness. Or read a book from someone across the world, even though they're not in the same room, their mind and their spoken voice is with us. So the book tries to develop some of these strands and then put them together in ways that I hope will be an encouragement to listening and curiosity and to belonging.
Thank you. You just spoke about the role that art has or can have, and it is maybe difficult to find a universal definition of what art is, but you deal with, in your book also with the artistic production of humans, both in very far away past and also in the present. So I don't know if this can be a way of introducing another important aspect, which is our role in the soundscape of the world, let's say, but also as producers of sound, maybe in a specific, in a very specific way compared to animals, or maybe not.
Yeah, I mean that's a big question, and I mean maybe we could start with the ways that we are beautiful contributors to the world, and by that I mean a deep sense of beauty of something that is right, and that our senses and then our emotions and our intellect understand that it is right and therefore it is beautiful. I mean, there are other definitions of beauty, of course, as well, but and thinking about human speech and human song and the music that we make, there are very, very few other species on this planet that have quite as sophisticated a control of sound as they make their voices, and the layers of nuance that can emerge through that sound as we're speaking. I mean, a word full of vowels and consonants, if you plot out the spectrogram, every millisecond there's a different layer of sound, a different turn and twist in how I'm shaping my mouth, and I can't even think about it consciously as I speak, otherwise I'll stumble over my words. That's extraordinary, and it conveys all ideas and meanings and directions about the present, the past, the future, in ways that we know of no other species that does it quite like that. And also through our music, of course, speaking to one another, both in words, but also beyond words in instrumental music. Birds have extraordinarily rich vocabulary, whales, dolphins, fish, some insects, but we fit within that larger world of sound making. And yet, curiously, for a creature whose culture is based so much on making sound and listening to sound, we are curiously inattentive to the sounds sort of beyond those of immediate concern to us. So the sounds of creatures, birds and insects and things living in our neighborhood, the ways that our engines and industry affect them. And then even beyond the limits of human perception, the sounds that are down in the ocean, below the waves, things that you have to drop a hydrophone, you use some technology. So for a very oral species, we're also very good at blocking off the sound signals from other species. And in that, we become destroyers. Because if we're not listening carefully to the world, and yet we're a very powerful species, if we cease to listen, then how can we be good neighbors? How can we be good kin to the rest of life if we are quite literally not listening? And we understand this really well in human relationships, right? If I'm in a relationship with someone, and if it's a romantic relationship or family, friendship, and I stop listening to the other people, that's not going to go well for me or the relationship. And yet, am I listening to the wheat from which my lunch came? Am I listening to the ocean from which food and dinner comes? Am I listening beyond my immediate physical needs for food to the voices of the forests of the world? And mostly the answer is no, and collectively, certainly the answer has been no. And so I think one role for art is to sort of wake us up and to say, not to point the finger and say, this is the conclusion you should arrive at, but to open the door and say, let's pay attention. Let's give the world that precious gift of our attention and see where that leads us. And my attention will lead me to particular places, but you will listen in your own way, in your own place, and might come to radically different conclusions. And that's the beauty about attention, is it's not directive, it's generative, and it allows for diversity of response as well.
I think that what you just said also connects to another underlying important topic of the book, which is the perceptual crisis we are dealing with as a species inhabiting this planet, which is also related to the climatic crisis, so a crisis of sensory extinction, quoting. Yesterday when we were speaking with Attila while having lunch, you were talking about the fact that more and more scholars, researchers, when they deal with sonic information that has been recorded, they deal with it by looking at spectrograms, or more and more often making machine look at these spectrograms in order to extract patterns and discover things. So we leave the machines not even really to listen, to look at what has been recorded, and somehow we are listening less and less. So I find this is an invitation to leave our studios, leave the classrooms, and spend more time outdoors. But there's also much more than this. So every one of us has our own perceptual system, which is partly different from those of everyone else. So we are very limited in this. So on the one hand, it is good to have sensors and microphones and so on. But at the same time, we have to maybe experiment more with this system in order also to be aware of our limits, of our position in the world. So I don't know if you want to say something about this, also giving us some example. Maybe.
Yes, I mean, so are we still on here? Okay, speaking of listening and sound, we'll share the mic. So one level, a very general level, so education system, at least my experience of education was to go in a classroom or a laboratory, and we quite literally close the doors and shut out the voices of the rest of the living earth. And we listen to what the teacher has prepared for us that day. And there's room for that kind of education. And there are lots of brilliant teachers who create spaces for learning and for connection. I'm not against all kinds of indoor learning. But in my own work, I've found that has become more and more limiting because it brings the agency exclusively and the power exclusively within the human, and generally locates it just for the teacher. And so for my classes now, we spend at least half of the time outdoors, and there may be particular goals that we have for the day to learn about, these trees or this process of writing. But in being outdoors, we open ourselves to the possibility of the unexpected. We give the crows and the gulls and the trees an opportunity to insert themselves into the lesson through something that I had no idea was going to happen when I got out of bed that morning. And we can then use that as a basis of teaching and discussion and conversation about the intelligence of crows, or the ways that trees are connected to one another, or how we relate to the rest of the living world. And I do this in science, but also in writing classes. So actually just physically locating ourselves in places where there are other species. In a city, it might be on the street where there's one street tree and pigeons. I mean, there are other species everywhere, and then creating the opportunity to connect with them and quite literally to listen to them, I think is important in that it uncenters the human, but doesn't erase the human. It's still a human activity to have a teacher outside with students. So in a general sense, the more we can get the walls of the classroom to be permeable to the voices of other species, I think the better we will be at then as teachers and as learners, and we're all both teaching and learning regardless of our official role in the classroom, the better we'll be then culturally
relating to other species. Specifically within the science of studying sound, there is I mean, I've heard this as I've traveled and talked about my work again and again, a scientific a push for scientists to gather lots of sonic data to feed it straight into the computer, and numerous people never sitting down to just put on the headphones and listen to the recordings that they've made of the rainforest or the oceans to see what the human senses, what an embodied human reaction to this sound that's been captured by a machine is. And I think even if the primary method of analysis is through AI or through statistical tools that extract patterns out of data, if we remove our bodies, we might as well be brains floating in jars with wires coming into them, and that's not human. That's a sort of very dystopian view, and it also means that the materiality and the ecology of the world has no chance of affecting us in that deepest place where we make decisions about the purpose of our life, which is the place where our senses and our intellect, our body, our emotions come together. And in that synergy, that's where we look for meaning. Like if we've got a clever idea, but the idea means nothing to our body, that idea will fizzle for a while and then die. But an idea that connects to the body, to the senses, the emotions, and connects outward into our community is an idea that has a potential to really move us. And we need more of, in an age of apathy and distraction, we need that sense of, I know who I am and this is my purpose. And I'm not saying I have the clearest idea of that, but I do think when we remove our bodies, as our education system, as the scientific system so many times does, we've lost the foundation, the human foundation of ethics. And that's deeply problematic. And of course, but it fits in greatly, very well with an extractive economy. So when I order something through the internet, which I do, press the click button, it arrives on my doorstep in a cardboard box. I have no relation whatsoever to the source of where those materials came from. I didn't even say hello to a merchant. It just arrived anonymously in a box. And that seems to me the peak of disembodiment. And no wonder then that we are trashing the rainforests, and the oceans are full of horrendous levels of sound that are so loud and distracting that whales are now swimming the oceans filled, suffused with stress hormones, and beaching themselves, trying to get away from the hellacious sound that we have pumped in the oceans and continue to pump into the oceans as we search for oil, as we ship things around the world. So as we disembody ourselves, it's not just that we lose a rudder for our meaning because we're a powerful species. As we lose meaning and rootedness in the world, other species then suffer. And then, of course, also other human communities suffer as well. And so the exploitation and destruction of biodiversity goes often hand in hand with human injustice. So I've been talking a lot about sort of other species, but these inequities also apply within our own species. So I mean, that seems a little grim, but I also think that coming back to our body and coming back to our senses is a source of joy and of joyful connection. And that's another thing that art can give us, is this sense of reanimation that helps us see the world in all its beauty and its brokenness together, that great paradox of simultaneous unspeakable beauty and fathomless brokenness are both true at the same time. And we have to find our way through that. And I think that's what attention, listening, attending to the details, the granularity of the sensory world around us can offer us.
Thank you. I forgot to say that if you want to join the conversation, it's very open. I don't know if it is also the best moment. I don't know about the timing. I asked the curators. Maybe yes.
Questions, thoughts?
I know Massimo had a question.
Grazie. I have many questions, which most of them you already answered. And actually, my question was, was about, how do you put together science and art if they are different. But you answer during your talk. But I will do a more direct question. I was touched by, just to going back to the first chapter of the Song of Trees, I go back to a moment where, you know, the coral trees is a very high tree. I mean, you go up with a ladder, and so as if you climb up different strata of atmosphere and different strata of animal playground, I would say. And then there is a moment that it's really, I just say, breathless, when the writer, actually David, recognized that the rain is below his feet, because the rain passed, leaves collect the water, and then suddenly a breeze just moved the leaves, and then was raining, but the raining was not on the clouds, but was on the tree. And to me, this is a beautiful figure of poetry. So I say, when you do your research, I mean, you say you are looking for references, a scientific reference. Do you also read poem books nearby while I write? And if there are kind of another, I would say, filone, ramo, branch of references that are not appearing directly in the book, but in a way or another there are.
Well, thank you for that question. And let me say about the question about science and art and putting them together. I think one place that we need to put them together more is in the education system. And still, there's often a division of science and a division of art, and a few people who manage to connect them. But really, if you're studying art, taking a class in you know, the physics of materials or the ecology of the soil is an extraordinarily generative thing to do. Or if you're studying some ecological or physical process as a scientist, taking a class where you're thinking more creatively about your writing, or thinking about how visual art works and how we speak to one another, and how painting speaks. All of that is as humans, our brain isn't divided into science and art here. We're integrated, and yet we've created education systems that are quite literally divided. They have fractures and fissures in them. So the more we can do to draw that together in our own lives, but also institutionally, which is why I think, say, sound studies and other sort of interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary approaches are potentially very powerful, because they in an institutional form embody the value of interconnection. But in terms of my own work, yes, my reading of poetry was the thing that got me into writing in the first place. As a kid, I used to read quite a bit of poetry because I love the rhythm of language. And you know, whether it's even just silly little rhymes that are humorous and so on, there's a beat in that. You can feel the music coming through, and you can feel it in your body, particularly if you read it aloud. And then there's a sort of vigor of language. I mean, one of the English poets that I read, Ted Hughes, who's you know, a controversial figure now a little bit, but in very short poems managed to capture the essence of a predatory fish or of an ordinary blackbird on the lawn in such vivid detail in just maybe 25 words. And that really spoke to me as electrifying to read that. And as a kid, I didn't realize I was being electrified. I just, well, this is wonderful. I want to spend some time with these words. And so I continue to do that, reading. But my reading tends to be not, let's say I'm working on a particular tree, say olive trees or the sabo tree in the Amazon. I don't, and maybe I should, but I don't seek out so much poems about that particular subject. It's more I want to read widely and be inspired in a wider way by the rhythmicity of language and the ways of thinking about how the world works and how we relate to the world. So poets like Kathleen Jamie and Nicole Brown and others, contemporary poets who really think and live very deliberately in relation to other species and to places and landscapes and seascapes. And it's thrilling to me to live vicariously in a way through their work. And then, whenever I'm traveling, as a kid, I used to go to all the natural history museums. Now I usually go to the art museums because I find, and often exhibits that I think this is going to have nothing to say to me. Those are the ones that I try to go to because there's often something from a completely different direction that inspires me, and I write little things down in my notebook. And so that is a practice that I really try and encourage in my own students and do in my life a lot, is to open to possibilities of experiencing other ways of thinking, because it always falls back into our own work. And I'm a very imperfect example of doing that, but I think just like a tree, and an olive tree is the best example of this, that spreads its roots all over because you never know where the rain is actually going to come. And the olive tree, one of the reasons they thrive in semi-arid areas is that they have very flexible root systems, and their trunks are so gnarled, partly because over the decades they expand and contract different parts of their trunk. We need to do that intellectually as well in our work, so that we're, in our 30s or 50s or 60s and on, we're expanding unanticipated different parts of ourselves.
Thank you. Other questions from the audience?
Thank you, Francesco. So, David, my question is not a real question, but it's just, let's talk about lateral line. Okay, I'm very into that, thanks to your lines. So, basically, from what I understood, lateral line is something that fishes have. Okay. And I realized I got to understand that fishes' aesthetics in terms of isonomy, that is the perceiving, as this sort of melt between movement and listening and hearing. Okay. And I arrived to question also. This opened my brain in a very huge way, because you tell in your book that humans have this kind of experience as well, but we need to define the differences between gestures and words, between music and dance, even if it's a unique experience. But language impact and affect the way we perceive as well. So thanks to the deepening of the lateral line and the understanding of what can be, I realized that it resonates a lot for me with architecture, with body's proximities, with society. And so I realized also that I can arrive to listen not only in a cochlear way. It's not listening, it's not something only related to ears. So my question could be, okay, even maybe if you can just say something else about these incredible things, and if there is some experience in you that from the more than human subjects, you got to unlearn the human listening.
Thank you. No, that's a wonderfully rich set of convergences. And just to sort of explain for folks who, the lateral line, if I were a fish, in my skin there would be little grooves, and in those grooves are tiny little hairs that detect the motion of the fish. And also they allow the fish to hear its surroundings. And fish also have an inner ear, somewhat like ours, that responds to sound. And so for fish, sense of movement in the environment and the sense of the environment's movement over the fish are intimately intertwined with hearing. And the same is, I mean, think about the human inner ear. That's our sense of hearing is partly based there, but also our sense of balance. And so when when you have an ear infection and you can't hear so well because your ears are blocked up, you also often have vertigo. And the reason for that is that our inner ear is essentially a fish inner ear that has come onto land. We don't have the sensors on our skin. We have them very briefly when we're embryos, and then they go away, unfortunately. Otherwise, sitting in a bath would be an amazing experience to feel the bath water going over you in a way that, you know, our imagination can barely get there. And this connection between motion and sound is there right at the root of all animal sensing. It's true in insects as well. They sense motion in their limbs. They also sense sound in their limbs. So bodily motion and sound have been connected, and hearing have been connected right from the origin of animal evolution. Invertebrates is another way in which they're connecting, in that when I speak or sing, or when a bird is singing, or when a frog is croaking, or even a fish making vocalizations with its swim bladder, the part of the brain that controls rhythmicity is the same, and it comes from this place where the hindbrain joins onto the top of the spinal column in development, very small part of the tissue, and it's the same in fish, birds, reptiles, mammals, all of the vertebrate animals, and that is the same area that controls rhythmic motion of the forelimbs. So when you know, at a concert, people go like this with their hands, or when a drummer is drumming with their hands like this, or a violin player is bowing, they're reenacting a really ancient connection between producing vocalizations, producing sound, and moving the forelimbs. So it's a very, very ancient, it's a sort of atavistic experience, if you like, of the simplest things like clapping your hands or snapping your fingers to a tune. And one way in which I experienced this in a sort of roundabout way, and it did change the way I listen, is when I tried to learn the violin, something that I'm still working on. This was during when the pandemic was first coming out and we were all locked down. My partner is a violin player, so I rented a violin from the local store, and she taught me how to play. And as a violinist, you put the violin, of course, up under the chin, but I'd never realized, I've seen lots of violin players, of course, but I'd never realized what an intimate experience that is between the vibrating wood and the bone in your jaw, which leads directly up to the inner ear, which is how our ancestors heard. And I felt that I was sort of reenacting that embryological connection between the movement of limbs, making sound, but also involving a tree as well, which of course I've spent a lot of time thinking about and trying to commune with trees. And this was an entirely new way. He was this vibrating sheet of wood that was part of my sound making. And so I was traveling back in time and sort of reliving the ancestors, the ancient fish from which we evolved, but also I was becoming a chimera with an animal tree hybrid to create this music. And now when I hear violin music, I feel it in my limbs because I've played a little bit, and I feel it in the jaw in a way that I never felt it before. So it's changed my experience of listening to other people play violin. And they make pleasant sounds as well. I still make sounds that my aesthetics maybe need to be more diverse. But as you know, playing the violin, when you're a beginner, there are all sorts of unusual, shall we call, maybe experimental sounds from intonation. But that very simple, just learning an instrument, took me back to, because of I know all this zoological stuff, became actually a very moving experience for me. It's one of those key experiences in my life that sort of emerged from that time.
Actually, you can use the mic. Now it's going on. It is going on? Yeah. Just try to use it.
Okay, now it's on.
Thank
Yep,
you.
yeah, good. Other questions? Yes, please.
Today I have a question about what you think, what should be right landscape approach to the soundscape. You mentioned yesterday that there are like dead trees, they attract insects, but if landscape architect do the same, it will be a sort of artificial approach. Is it good for the biodiversity of the place, or maybe it's a better way to attract sounds to the place where it's like quite silent? What do you think about it?
About including dead wood?
I mean, or to plant some plants which attract bees, like with blossom, like different types of it.
Yes, I mean, my basic answer is yes, but I think in terms of design, thinking about how we put together plans for built environments or managed environments, thinking about the whole, one area might be very much focused on a place for people to gather and maybe very close mown lawn and a few shade trees, a little like this space, which doesn't have an enormous level of biodiversity, and it seems that's entirely appropriate if at a bigger scale we've got other areas that have more pollinator plants and dead wood. And so I don't think you can bring every single element into a design. Of course, design has particular focus and design goals, including as much opportunity for other species to make themselves known in both in the sound but in other senses as well. So aromatic plants, the texture of different tree bark. I mean, it's an experiment I encourage you all to do, is to look at a tree but also touch it with your fingers, and there will be things at your fingertips teach you about the tree bark that your eyes can never disclose to you. And every species of tree has an entirely different texture and sandiness and grittiness and cool or warm. So including multiple avenues for that sort of sensory connection for both the human senses and also then the more than human. I mean, do you have thoughts on?
I had another, oh no, Elisa?
Yeah. I also have a question that is more like a curiosity, that is about how trees are reacting to the sound pollution we are doing. Because I know of birds, for example, that change their tone and volume just to react to the noise we produce as humans. And so it is just a curiosity if also plants and trees are reacting to this in a way.
Yeah, that is an excellent question, one that I've thought about quite a bit but haven't done any experiments on. I do know, though, that when trees experience a lot of vibration, and this is very well known because it happens even away from urban areas, like on a windy hillside or mountainside where there's a lot of vibration, the tree grows differently with a lot of vibration of the kind that you get close to a road or railway line. That they add extra lignin, which is the tough, strong molecule in wood. They thicken the cells. The roots are more tightly gripping the ground. So the form of the tree differs depending on the sonic environment in which it's grown. And sort of a long-term project might be to say grow different trees in different sonic environments and then make musical instruments from those to see what this is the sound of maple that was grown in the city compared to maple that was grown somewhere else. Now there are lots of other variables involved in that, but I do think that's one way in which sort of an experimental music project that would be worthwhile. The thing that goes along with noise is also particulate air pollution. And we do know that ozone and particulate pollution stops the trees from communicating so well to each other. So the chemicals that go from one tree to another get blocked by the chemical pollution. Wow. Or the aromas of flowers that are important, at least in some trees, like the tilia trees, basswood trees, and linden is another word for the same group of trees, make this incredible sweet aroma in May and June. But traffic pollution cuts that off, so the bees can't smell it. Even over just a meter or two, the pollution removes it. So that's another way in which the sensory environment is changed And we can taste it. If we on the waterfront here from the boats with all the diesel fumes and things, you can taste that in the air, the same as on a very busy street, you can taste that in your mouth. For other creatures, it really impacts their ability, especially plants, their ability to communicate one with another.
Thank you.
Do we have other questions or
Can I just
doubts?
ask one very shortly? Do we have time?
Sure.
No, I have a question which relates to some of the things you said in the last answers, and also to the question that Massimo Bartolini asked earlier, which is about your relation with music, because I was surprised section by section reading Sounds Wild and Broken, and especially towards the end, there is a lot of writing about music, and I was surprised because you mentioned things that I knew very well and others that I didn't know, so I went to discover them, and they are not at all obvious choices, but they are very interesting choices. They are very pondered in the context of the book you have written, and they testify a very attentive and open-minded approach to also to contemporary music. So Massimo was asking about the literary references if you read poems, and what I wanted to ask is if your musical education, your musical taste is also somehow had an impact in your work and also in your writing, and especially in writing this book, and maybe especially the last part of this book.
Yeah, thank you. My formal music education is almost non-existent. I've had music lessons in some piano and guitar and things like that. And I used, as a teenager, I would go on the Paris Metro and play the guitar to get some money. So I understood the relationship between tone and income in that sense. But I should credit my partner, Katie Lehman, who's a professional violinist and runs a performance venue in Atlanta where we live, who really helped me expand my mind into deeper ways of listening to human music, particularly in the orchestral world. And we have both, in different ways and sometimes together, have explored, listening to interesting compositions, depending on where we've lived, interesting composers who are trying to put things together in ways that seem vivid. And in my own work, there's a sort of a reciprocal relationship between going to the forest and just listening to birds, or putting my hand down in the sand and listening to the beach and the waves through my fingertips, and then listening to more to experiences that we put a frame around and call music, right? So that I buy a ticket, I go to a concert hall, I sit and I listen. We call that music, whereas if I go to the forest, that's not going to a concert. And I think the forest is just as much an improvised musical event as going to an improvised jazz concert. But the examples that I picked for the end of the book, I tried to pick people, say Angelica Negron, who's a Puerto Rican artist based mostly in New York now, who really pays attention to the materiality of sounds from everyday objects and also from manufactured objects and robots and so on, which I hope echoes some other themes from the book. And then David Rothenberg is another example, someone who he's a philosopher, a writer, a clarinetist who plays with nightingales and whales and engages in that interspecies dialogue in a very literal way and in a very experimental, open-ended way, which I hope resonates with some of the other aspects of the book. And he's written a number of wonderful books himself about listening and sound in the more than human world. Yes, listening to forms of music that, like going to classical music concerts and jazz concerts, but also going to places where people are doing more experimental work that I don't know if it's a concert or a sonic experience and so on, but there's always something interesting happening there that then I take to the forest that helps me listen to birds better. And then I bring what I learned from the insects and the birds back and back and forward. And then always remembering that the musical instruments are that place where both are true. A violin is both a forest and it's about human artistry.
I think we're ready.
Sì. Thanks a lot, David and Francesco, for this beautiful conversation. I guess there might have been many more questions, including mine, but we try to have a schedule. Sì, volevo anticiparvi, vi lasciamo qualche minuto per sgranchirvi le gambe e qualcos'altro, e riprendiamo tra 10 minuti con la conferenza di Niklashi Joshi in 10 minutes, yeah. E poi magari introduciamo poi la sua presenza, e forse anche ci sarebbe tanto da dire su come i punti che abbiamo pensato in questo programma insieme al progetto con Massimo stanno venendo veramente insieme anche nelle cose che avete detto, e ogni giorno questa mappa si sta componendo in modi per me che confermano, come dire, il progetto e il suo orizzonte. Quindi grazie ancora e ci rivediamo tra un po' di minuti. Grazie.